Welcome to all of you who are here live and who watch the recording later on to today's Fridays for Future event called Doing Climate Science Research at 2 Biological Stations in Michigan. Those of you who follow climate science know that there are regular reports from climate scientists around the world that track our progress or lack thereof on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But I think fewer people may realize that some climate science research is done in the state of Michigan. And so as we talked about possibilities for this year's Fridays for Future event, we thought it might be interesting to have representation from 2 of those biological research stations in Michigan. So one of our speakers today is Dave Karowe, who's a faculty member at Western in the Department of Biological Sciences. Dave's a co-founder of Western Michigan University's Climate Change Working Group. And for over 30 years, he's spent his summers in Pellston, Michigan, not just to get cooler weather probably, but because he's mentoring research by undergraduates at U of M's biological station there. We'll also be joined by 3 people from Kellogg Biological Station, Namir Baker, Moriah Young, and I have to check my notes here, Kara Dobson. Sorry, Kara. And so I'm going to just turn the meeting over to them after mentioning that there are some events coming up. And I think we'll hold other comments from other people who know things that are coming up that we should join until the end of the program. But we've had a lot of activity recently with the Earth Day Election Edition event on Sunday at Bronson Park. And we'll be having our final lobby meeting with Fred Upton's office next Friday, a week from today. And maybe some of you can join us for that as well. But I'm going to turn it over now to Dave.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. So I'll talk about some of the large-scale climate-related research projects going on at the biological station. Most of them I'm not involved in, or at least the 2 big ones I'm not, but they're really good overall projects and long-running ones. So biological station, U of M biological stations right up there, mailing address is Pellston, but it's really in the woods and on the shore of Douglas Lake. And Pellston's about 6 miles away. This is the lake that the station is on. The bio station is along South Fishtail Bay, which is a fairly protected part of the lake, and also one that's not visited very often by people who live on the other end. University of Michigan owns about half the shoreline of this lake, so it remained pretty pristine. Biostation started in 1909, and research was always part of the activity that occurred there, but the climate change research really started expanding in about 1985. And there are 4 projects I'd like to briefly describe. The first one has the acronym FASET, which stands for Forest Accelerated Succession Experiment. Things were done that made the normal process of forest succession happen faster. The second was a follow-up, an extension from some information gathered in the FASET experiments called FORTE, Forest Resilience Threshold Experiment, which basically asked, is there a level of disturbance above which basically a forest cannot easily recover its carbon sequestration level? The third is stuff that I've been doing for a couple decades, exposing plants to elevated CO2 and asking what happens to them and things that feed on them. And then the last is what Marianne mentioned, that for 33 years, I think, we've been running an REU program where we bring undergrads from around the country to spend a summer at the biostation and do research that now has to be related to climate change in some way. Okay, so the FASET experiment, remember it's the whole goal was to make succession happen faster. And the way they did that was girdled 7,000 trees that are early successional, so they were reaching the end of their lifespan anyway. And they were aspen and birch. They were girdled, and that killed them. And over the next 2 or 3 years, they all died and fell over. And the question was, what happens to a forest, or to the forest carbon sequestration, when the forest transitions from the early successional, sort of right after fire type community, to the mid-successional, maybe 100 years later? And the concern was that as the early successional trees die, the mid-successional trees that are small and in the understory will just not be able to take up the slack. And so forests will become a carbon source to the atmosphere. And the answer was surprising, that the understory mid-successional trees, mostly red oak and white pine, were actually very quickly able to take up the slack, able to compensate for the carbon sequestration that the previous trees had been doing. So it took only about a year or two. And that meant that the forest really never stopped being a carbon sponge, which is of course good news. But there was a caveat. That only was true up to about 65% loss of forest biomass. So some disturbances, climate-induced disturbances, may the forest may be resilient to them, but larger ones probably not. And so that led to the FORTE experiment, forest resilience threshold experiment. And it was a different part of the forest. UMBS has a lot of forest around it. And then trees of all species, not just early successional, were in all sizes, were girdled last year. And they were girdled in plots that added up, the biomass removal added up to either 45, 65, or 85% of the original canopy loss. And what they were doing is bracketing what the FASET experiment said may be a threshold, a resilience threshold, above which the forest is not resilient, below which it is. Okay, this is Chris Goff holding, I assume, a trophy girdle ring that I think he's probably taken home and mounted on his den wall. He is from Virginia Commonwealth University, and he's the one who is the PI on the grants for both of those, both FASET and FORTE. So the main question was, is there a disturbance level, a threshold disturbance level, which they thought would be 65%, above which forests are no longer resilient? And the answer is, there's no evidence of that yet, but it's really only the first year of the experiment. So the girdle trees mostly haven't died yet, and they're still photosynthesizing. So it's a little too early to tell, but in 2 years, we should know. The third climate-related research program is one that I was doing for 15 years or so, where plants were exposed to elevated CO2 inside these field chambers. Half of them had CO2 pumped in at the base. It all goes out, all the air goes out the top, because each of these metal boxes houses a fan. So the CO2 is blown through, comes out the top, but inside the elevated chamber, it was about 750 parts per million. Inside an adjacent ambient chamber was, when I started, maybe 375 parts per million. So plants were grown under elevated CO2, and then the plants were analyzed, and their composition was analyzed, but so was their value as a food resource for the next level in the food chain, the next trophic level, mostly caterpillars. So the main question was, how does plant growth under elevated CO2 affect the plant's ability to defend themselves via chemical defenses? And how does it affect their value as a food resource for the next trophic level? There were other questions too, but these were the ones, those were probably the two biggest ones. So it turns out that when plants are grown under elevated CO2, They change, and the changes in the plants affect at least 2 levels higher in the food chain. Okay, so plants grown under elevated CO2 had higher levels of chemical defenses. As long as the chemical defenses did not contain nitrogen, they had higher levels before they were attacked. We simulated herbivore attack by pressing them with a garlic press, but they were less able, and in many cases not at all able, to increase their chemical defenses in response to attack. So they were better defended before attack, but they could not increase their levels of defense when they were attacked. They, under elevated CO2, they had lower levels of nitrogen. So that's the main nutrient for pretty much all animals, including insect herbivores. And so the caterpillars, which were mostly our insect herbivores, ate a lot more. They just ate 50%, sometimes 100% more material, but they digested it less well. Problem is, eating is dangerous because it creates the edges of leaves that have been eaten, and the leaf material that passes through the caterpillar both contain volatile cues that their natural enemy, a parasitoid wasp, uses to find them. And if they increase their consumption because nitrogen levels in the plant were lower, they consumed more and were much easier to find, much more vulnerable. So instead of 15% of them getting killed by their natural enemies, as many as 60% were on the elevated plants. And lastly, our long-running REU program. There's actually a Western Michigan University student here, that's Troy DeHagen. But we get a couple hundred applications, and we bring up 10 people from pretty much all around the country. And like I said, it's been going for over 30 years, but in the last 15 or so, we've decided that every project had to, in some way, address climate change. And we were very good at figuring out how a project could connect with climate change, I have to say, or at least we were creative. So it's about 150 student projects over that time. I'll just show the results of a couple of them. One is, here's a carnivorous plant that grows in the bogs around here and up there. And when this carnivorous plant, sundews, when it was grown under elevated CO2 in the chambers, it produced more of the traits that it uses to capture insects. So it was less carbon limited, but more nitrogen limited under elevated CO2. So sundews produced more of the sticky dew and also more roots, other ways to get nitrogen. And another project looked at the effect of variable stream flow. Stream flow will get more variable under climate change with more heavy precipitation events and more periods without any or very little precipitation. So there's a facility up there where you can control the flow rate in artificial streams, and using that, an REU student determined that under future conditions of more variable stream flow, there are going to be winners and losers in stream algae. Green algae, like the ones on the left, are likely to be winners. They were a bigger part of the algal community in the variable flow treatment. But other groups like diatoms are likely to be climate losers. Unfortunately, diatoms are the preferred food of many of the grazers in Michigan rivers and streams. But definitely it'll have an effect on the first trophic level in streams. And this is one of our all camp photos. The REU students are in here. Steve Bertman and I are in here somewhere. It's a very vibrant community and very friendly community in the summer. Usually about 200 people, and including grad students and infants, and of course many PhD level researchers. Okay.
Assuming it's okay with everyone who's here, I'm going to ask you to hold your questions until after the other part of the presentation. But we have somebody who just came in who will be happy to listen to the remarks of Dave when they are up in the recording, when the recording is online. And Namir, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Marianne. And thanks, Dave, for the awesome introduction to all your work at UMBS and at Western. That was really cool to hear about. So yeah, very excited to get to chat with you all about some of the work that we have going on at KBS at Kellogg Biological Station, particularly pertaining to climate change research. And we've really just wanted to focus in particular on what undergrads get involved in when they're at KBS, just in case there's potentially any high school students in the audience that are maybe thinking about going down that path at some point. So I'm the science coordinator at the Kellogg Biological Station long-term ecological research site, which is where we have a few experiments set up to look at climate change that I'm excited to get to talk with you about, and also very honored to get to share the stage with Kara and Moriah, who are graduate students that do work at the LTER. And do you all want to introduce yourselves real quick there?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kara. I'm a PhD student at Michigan State, and my summer fieldwork takes place at KBS.
Hi everyone, I'm Moriah Young, and same as Kara, PhD student at Michigan State, and my research takes place at KBS as well.
Awesome, thank you guys. So yeah, I just to get started, I wanted to go to basics a little bit. So KBS stands for Kellogg Biological Station. And Dave got into this a little bit already, but a biological station is a place where really all sorts of interactions can be studied. So it's a location where we really focus on all of the things going on in the ecosystems that we get the opportunity to study in that place. And so for us, that means that we focus a lot on plants. We're have an ag focus to our mission. So we really look at what are the effects of different agricultural practices on things like yield, but also things like plant chemistry and our ability to convert them into biofuels, which will be a critical part of addressing the climate crisis. Here you can see Dr. Carolina Cordova. She's now a professor at University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and she's showing some of the undergraduate students that we had as interns before COVID, the switchgrass that grow in some of our bioenergy plots there. So lots of opportunities to study plants at KBS, not just in ag systems, also in prairie and forest, and then all sorts of other interactions as well. So there's a number of labs, including Doug Landis's lab and Phoebe Zarnetsky's lab, who Kara and Moriah are in, who also are interested in looking at insect interactions. So on the lower left there, you can see Ima Otudor, who is an REU student that we had at KBS, again, just before the pandemic. And she's looking at some sticky traps that we set up in all of our field sites to look at the effects of different types of agricultural practices, as well as prairie and perennial bioenergy systems on the insects that are in those plots and how those change over time. And then in the middle, we've got Ali Zahorek, who's a PhD student in Doug Landis's lab, and closely inspecting the aphids that are going to work on some milkweed there. So lots of opportunities to look at different trophic levels of interactions above ground, and then near and dear to my heart is what's going on below the ground, often I think overlooked. But here on the left, you can see Tavisha Martin. She's a graduate student, a PhD student in Christine Sprunger's lab at KBS right now, and she's really interested in the what's going on with the fauna below ground, so the fungi and the nematodes and the bacteria, and who's eating who, and then how does that correspond to where the carbon and nitrogen in the soil ends up, and then eventually percolates out to the atmosphere, so that students like Lele Ruan, who's shown there in the middle, can then look at that greenhouse gas that's coming off of the different fields that we have and look at how different agricultural practices, different climate years affect the carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gases that are coming off all these soils of interest. So lots of things going on below ground as well. So make sure to not forget that when you're thinking about climate change in particular. And yeah, that's something that we're well equipped to study at KBS, because we've been studying a lot of these interactions in the same place over a long period of time, going back to, in many cases, 30 plus years at the LTER. So that really gives us this power to look at how changing climate is also affecting the interactions in these systems. And one of the experiments that Karen Moriah will also be talking about that we've recently set up to go into that, the rain exclusion experiment down there. You can see one of our shelters in the lower left, they're members of Team Rex, or T-Rex as we affectionately refer to it. But you can see there that shelter is made so that we can exclude the rain that falls on an area. And then if you look really closely, you can also see that there's actually a sprinkler head right there that's dispensing some water at the moment. So that lets us control the amount of rainfall that falls on an area. And that's really important because that's a big part of what we know is going to happen to climate in Michigan in the future, is changes in rainfall patterns. Our resident engineer or wizard, Kevin Kmark, there in that picture in the middle, wearing the blue shirt, he's the one who designed those rainout shelters. And then he had a really fun project with Maggie Jones, who's an undergraduate student at Michigan State, who came down for an undergraduate research apprenticeship this last summer just after her freshman year at MSU. And then Veronica Pargolski as well. They both did some really cool work trying to help us nail down a knowledge gap we had in our rainout shelters that I'll talk about here in a minute. But first, I just wanted to go back to why those shelters are so useful for us when we're studying climate. In Michigan, we know that it is going to get warmer, but what this plot here shows on the right is just that the upper Midwest in general is a place that we know is going to get a lot wetter in the future, and is going to have more intense rainfall. So we'll have wetter springs and drier summers, more intense rainfall events. And all of that coming together means that we're going to have more severe dry spells between more intense rainstorms. And so our rainout shelters that Kevin designed let us test hypotheses related to how that is expected to play out, because we can control how much water is falling on a plot. We can induce a drought. We can just reduce the amount of water that falls over the course of the growing season, or we can play with variability. We can say, let's have the same amount of rainfall as you would in an average year, but let's have a lot of it all at once, and then we'll stretch it out and not have rain for a while and repeat that cycle so we get that episodic rainfall that we're expected to have in the future. And then Phoebe Zarnetsky's lab gets to take things to the next level when looking at climate change with their open top warming chambers that you can see here in the foreground under some of our shelters. And those are basically little time capsules that let you look into the future by warming those plots a little bit. And Karen and Moriah will be talking about those. So I'll leave that to them. But I did just want to go back to Maggie's summer project. So one of the things that we didn't know about our shelters, we'd had them up for 2 years now, but we hadn't nailed down whether they affected the ability of plants to photosynthesize under them. So we know we're reducing rainfall, but we thought that we could also be having an effect on the radiation that comes through. So we just wanted to nail down whether that was going to create an artifact, something in our results that wasn't due to the climate change we were trying to induce, but due to some effect of our design. And so Maggie nailed down that was not the case, or at least that it was occurring, but not at a level that we need to be concerned about. So here on the left, you can see the PAR, or photosynthetically active radiation. That's the light that plants can make use of when they're trying to photosynthesize and create sugars. And you can see that it is higher in our ambient plots on the left and lower in our sheltered plots on the right, but we're still within this band in yellow where wheat can photosynthesize at maximal efficiency. So we don't have to worry about it. We are having an effect on photosynthetically active radiation, but by far the majority of the time, our wheat is getting just plenty of radiation to be able to photosynthesize, and so we can trust those results that we're getting from our study. So very excited that Maggie was able to carry out this study just in the summer after her freshman year, and hoping that we can get her back out at the station in the future. And we'll hopefully be doing that through, we've got another number of different avenues to do that through our summer programs. So this is one of the flyers for our programs that went out last year around January. And just I want to make sure that you all go ahead and bookmark that site down at the bottom, kbs.msu.edu/education. You can go there and read blog posts from some of the students that have gone through our programs, get a taste for what they got to do, what projects they got to get involved in. And then that's also where we'll be sending out an announcement for our programs when we open those up for 2023 in January. So keep an eye out for that. And now I'll turn it over to Karen and Moriah so they can talk a little bit about the undergrads that they've had an opportunity to mentor over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Samir. As we mentioned at the beginning, Kara and I are both PhD students at Michigan State. And our research is based on work that we carry out at Kellogg Biological Station, and specifically in that drought experiment using those rainout shelters that you can see in this photo here that Namir already mentioned, and also the open top chambers that are circled. And those simulate warming inside the chambers It's a passive warming, and they warm about 2 degrees Celsius on average year round. And we're in Dr. Phoebe Zarnetsky's lab that's based on main campus. And but our research at KBS is really focused on these effects of drought using the rainout shelters and warming on above ground responses, primarily plants, plant communities. But we're also looking at below ground responses as well. For example, I'm interested in looking at, or I am researching bacterial and fungal community responses to those 2 treatments. But we're, as a lab, the bulk of our measurements are taken on plant communities. So we're looking at, we're measuring phenological responses like timing of flowering and seed set. We're looking at plant growth, and we also measure a bunch of plant traits as well. And Kara also looks at volatile organic compounds as well on Canada goldenrod. And we look at insect herbivory on insect herbivory on these plants as well. So there's these multi-trophic interactions that we're looking at in this drought and warming climate stress or experiment. Yeah, and that picture there is an inside of one of the chambers, and you can, this is in the early successional plots, and you can tell there's a bunch of different plant species found within those. But you can probably imagine that this work takes a lot of hands, and more so than just what Kara and I can do ourselves. So we have a technician, but we also rely a lot on the undergrads that we get to work with each summer that we've been here. And so we're going to highlight some of the work that they've done with us.
Yeah, so the first undergraduate we're going to highlight is Kristen. She was hired in the summer of 2021 as an undergraduate research assistant, or a URA. And these URAs are typically hired just to help out with experiments and gain experience doing research. And so me and Moriah hired Kristen to help us out with our climate change work. And she also did some things like data entry and took a few classes while she was at KBS as well. And these URAs aren't expected to do any type of independent research project, but we're always more than happy to help out undergraduates if they have an interest in doing their own research. And so Kristen was interested and motivated to do some type of independent project. And so she did a project in that climate change experiment where she was interested in plant-insect interactions within the lens of climate change. And so she studied goldenrod galling, which galling occurs when insects lay their eggs inside of a stem of a plant. You can see it in that bottom right photo, that ball in the stem is a gall. And so she looked at how plant health via leaf greenness was affected by this galling and also by these different climate treatments. And I won't get too much into those results. If you're interested, you can always reach out and we can chat about it. But overall, it was just really cool to see Kristen come into KBS with no previous research experience. And then she left that summer having done an independent project with us. And Emily was another undergraduate that was hired in summer of 2021 as a URA. And she has a very similar story to Kristen. She was also interested in doing an independent project, and her and Kristen worked a lot together on their projects because they were very similar. But Emily also worked within that climate change experiment, looking at plant-insect interactions. And here's one of her results where she was measuring plant height responses. And Emily was also interested in continuing on in our lab. She wanted to stay and further her experience, both at KBS and within our lab. And so she's been working in our lab for probably about coming up on 2 years now. And this past summer, she was hired as a technician to work in our lab. And she, as a technician, she helped with our experiments, helped with other experiments at KBS. And she also continued this plant insect project that she started in summer of 2021. And she's also potentially publishing a paper on the results of that project that she started in the summer of 2021 as an undergraduate. And so I think that's a really cool thing to see, that she's potentially getting a scientific paper published from her undergraduate research that she did at KBS.
And this is Jordan, another URA, but from this past summer. He primarily worked with our technician, Mark Hammond, and similar story. Again, URAs aren't expected to do their own individual research project, but he expressed interest in doing so. And so we had all this data from 2021, this biomass data where we harvested all the plant material in our plots, dried it, weighed it, and then so we have, we can get this average biomass across each of our climate treatments. And so that's the graph that's shown on this plot here, the variations in the biomass between each of those. And again, a similar story, Jordan, a lot of times the work doesn't stop after the undergrads leave. So there's opportunities for them to stay on to continue helping with various field work. And he's also still involved in our lab on main campus as a junior and working on a different project that's not related to this, but still involved in our lab as well, which is cool to see. And this is Lee. So Lee was an RU student, which Dave mentioned up at UMBS. They have a RU program. We have an RU program at KBS as well. And that's different from the URAs at KBS in that they are expected to do an individual research project, and they work 40 hours on research, and they don't take any classes like the URAs do. And they also come from outside institutions. So Lee came from Ohio Wesleyan, and their project was looking at a past drought, so 2021 drought that we imposed using those rainout shelters, and looking at the effect of that past drought on this past year's 2022 wheat growth. And so the plot shown here is they measured height of the wheat across the various different treatments. And if you're looking closely at the graph, it's different than the treatments that Kara and I have talked about. I can talk about that if you have questions about it, but we did something a little different plots than what our main lab is generally focused on. But yeah, again, like I said, I worked really closely with Lee, and it was really awesome to see how they gained confidence over their 10 weeks at KBS. And I felt like their experience there really empowered them and made them feel more welcome in this academic science field. And KBS is a pretty well, KBS is a really welcoming community too. So it just helps to be there and feel like you belong. And yeah, it really empowered them to continue on in research afterwards. And they took initiative to apply to go to the LTER's All Scientists meeting in California that took place in September and was chosen. And so they got to present their research there. And also it seems like this RU program has opened some doors for them at their home institution as well. Just created more opportunities with them, which is really awesome to see.
Yeah, so we just wanted to end by highlighting some photos of these undergrads presenting their research at various conferences. And we wanted to say thanks for the opportunity to talk about our research that we do at KBS and highlight these experiences that some undergraduates have had. And we have listed there the KBS social media handles and also each of our emails. And definitely feel free to reach out if you have questions about anything. And we'll gladly take questions now as well.
Okay. Thank you for holding the questions. And I'm guessing that there are a lot of questions of various types. So if you want to raise your hand, I can't necessarily see everybody, though I should be able to on the screen at the same time. So you can raise a physical hand or a virtual hand. And Rick, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I have kind of a little more general question about the carbon dioxide and how it disperses into the air. Sometimes I think of it as just kind of a thin layer around the earth but it way up in the atmosphere, but it may be evenly dispersed in the atmosphere as well. So I'm asking about the dispersion. These people are trying to take carbon dioxide out of the air, carbon capture or something like that. Would they have to go to the upper atmosphere to get it, or can it be drawn out anywhere in the atmosphere? Is it evenly dispersed or concentrated in certain areas?
And I'm seeing responses from both Dave and Namir. So either of you want to start, Dave?
Yeah, it's a great question, Rick. Actually, I have never really thought about the vertical profile of CO2, at least not, within the living skin of the planet. CO2 is both long-lived and what's considered a well-mixed greenhouse gas. So the concentrations in the atmosphere are, at least at one height in the atmosphere, are very, very similar every place in the planet. So if you measure it on top of the volcano in Hawaii, Mauna Loa, that's going to be almost the same level as anywhere else in the northern hemisphere. A little bit different in the southern hemisphere because winter and summer are reversed. So I think there isn't much spatial variation for sure horizontally, maybe vertically as well, but I don't know. Namir or Susan, does either of you know?
Namir, I saw you reacting a little bit too. Do you want to add?
No, I think you're spot on, Dave. I was going to also bring up the Mauna Loa Observatory, but I think that also as humans, we've done a good job of distributing where we're producing CO2 from all around the world. So that also contributes to the fact that there's not great differences because we are relatively well mixed given that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even though the developed countries in the northern hemisphere emit way, way, way more than all the countries, almost all in the southern hemisphere. It's not like the northern hemisphere air has way more CO2. So it gets mixed pretty quickly, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. Rick, are you satisfied with the answers you've received?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, Tim.
Okay, I follow the news and climate change every day. I'm constantly confronted with the urgency of the climate crisis, which is extremely serious. And I'm going to quote to you a bit of an article that I read this morning. The world faces a rapidly closing window to meet the Paris Agreement's goals, warns the latest emissions gap report from the United Nations Environmental Program. The report, which explores the impact of new pledges on the gap towards meeting the Paris targets, finds that while progress has been made in recent years to mitigate emissions and deploy more clean energy, it is insufficient, and I'll repeat that, is insufficient to put the world on a path to limit warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 this century. Despite the ambitious pledges, there's been quote, limited progress in the year since COP26, it says. In a stark warning, I repeat, in a stark warning, the new UNEP report says that incremental change is, quote, no longer an option, unquote, and that avoiding dangerous levels of warming will require, quote, wide-ranging, large-scale, rapid, and systemic transformation, unquote. End of my quotation. So my questions are you aware of this report? Number one, and number two, what are your respective institutions doing to inform the public about the state of the climate crisis and to educate them about what needs to be done to address it?
Okay, Namir, do you want to start with an answer to that?
Sure, Tim. No, I appreciate the question. I think so. I was not aware that the report had just recently come out, so I'll definitely follow up on that. But I do know that in terms of what our institutions are doing, and particularly KBS, a lot of our outreach on this issue is focused on farmers and land managers because we have that agricultural purview, and so we do host field days and try to get the word out about practices that we believe have promise based on results we've seen at the stations. So cover cropping, we definitely have, we've had multiple outreach events for that in the last couple of years. And then prairie strips, trying to convert parts of agricultural fields into conservation land to get some of those carbon sequestration and pollination benefits and erosion benefits from that. That's something that we've started to put a lot more resources into as well. There's a program called My Strips that I'll put the website for in the chat. That is started at KBS that's on that front. So that's where we believe that we have a lot of power, is to try and affect change through the practices that farmers in the upper Midwest are adopting. And then we also do a little bit of work as well on the policy front, trying to get involved in what's going to be in the Farm Bill through Senator Debbie Stabenow's office. We have that power in Michigan, which is really great, to try and get subsidies put in there for conservation land like the prairie strips that we're trying to spread the word on. And then more locally, we have a lot of focus on kind of teach the teacher outreach. So helping teachers, K through 12 teachers in Kalamazoo, Battle Creek area, get more effective at teaching climate science and spreading science literacy to their students. So that's a lot of how KBS is focused on trying to get the word out about the need to address climate change and avenues to do so, but always looking for more opportunities like this one here to talk about the issue.
I don't know, Moriah or Kara, if you want to add anything from your perspective about what KBS is doing before we turn to Dave. Or are you okay with?
I think Namir pretty much got it.
Okay, Dave, do you want to add what Western is doing?
Western, I probably shouldn't have left it muted, given what I'm going to say, but Western has been absolutely irresponsible in addressing climate change. We call ourselves or brand ourselves the university that is student-centered and so on. There's nothing more important to our students than preventing as much climate change as we can. Western does a few token things here and there, but there's really no concerted effort. That's why, almost 10 years ago, Paul Clements from political science, Ron Kramer from sociology, and I started our interdisciplinary climate change working group, which really took off once Denise Keel took the helm and united with the other climate aware and concerned organizations in the region, or at least the county, to make the Kalamazoo Climate Change Coalition. So there is stuff happening that is in part done by Western faculty. Cindy, for instance, and Susan are part of the climate change working group, but it's done on our own time. On top of everything else we do, there just is no real investment of Western into combating climate change. Although, the buildings that are built have to be very high efficiency. We do have an Office for Sustainability. Jeff Spolstra is very active in trying to get the university to do more, but so far it has not, and I think it's shameful.
And if I may, Dave, I don't know of anyone who's done it more than you have in terms of reaching out to the public. Would you care to estimate how many times you have given public presentations?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I've probably done close to 200 now. I actually did one yesterday, virtually, for the continuing education, sort of adult education at Hope College. So, and basically what I have been focusing on in the more recent presentations, because I think it matters more to people that will hear it, is how big a difference a 2-degree or a 1.5-degree future versus a 4-degree future would make for Michigan or the Great Lakes region. What does it mean for us? And people are, I think, they're more concerned if you talk about what it means for their own backyard. But yeah, the problem is that I've done a lot of talks. Thank you for mentioning it, Tim. But the problem is that the audiences aren't really the ones we need to get to. The ones we need to reach are the people who could be very concerned but aren't yet. And whose concern could translate into action. And that includes people who even potentially deny that climate is changing. I mean, they'll eventually accept the information that's blatantly obvious, but you know, a talk might be, you know, the first toe in the door for them to be, you know, be realistic. So the problem is the audiences are already thinking pretty much the way we are.
Okay, thanks to both of you. And I encourage those of you who don't generally follow the chat to read what Crystal has put in from her perspective about what has been happening at Western. We still have two other people whose hands are up, and I want to reserve some time for announcements at the end too. Nikki?
Yeah, I had a question relating to methane and nitrous oxide. I thought they were also really important to climate change. And does the forestry work at all address those issues? Because methane, especially with the feedback with the peat melting and the permafrost melting, that the feedback is what is going to be killing us. They're saying you can't stop it. So is there any work on the biological stations about that and keeping the methane in the ground type of thing?
Namir, I'm seeing you nod your head, so I'm going to call on you first.
Sure, I'd be honing in on my impulse, but no, we definitely at KBS, there's definitely a long history of work on greenhouse gases in carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide as the main ones. Phil Robertson's lab has really been pioneers in that area, and he's also one of the lead forces behind us getting the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center established at KBS, also behind getting the U.S. Department of Agriculture's long-term agro-ecosystem project installed at KBS. So he's really a kind of, you know, I don't want to wax too poetic, but he's very much a visionary in terms of how much he's devoted his career towards trying to figure out how to get a better handle on greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a lot of work that's come out of KBS then that's been integral to advancing that. One of the things we found is just that winter is actually an area where there's a lot more gas coming off of soils than people think. People just kind of assume that when there's snow on the ground, nothing's going on. A lot of the time that's because we prefer it to be so we don't have to get out there in the snow and sample it at that time of year. But if we do go out there and sample it those times of year, we do find that there's a lot of processes still occurring, and that there are nitrous oxide fluxes coming off the soil that differ depending on what you'd previously done that growing season to grow those crops. So there's a lot of work going on at KBS focused on not just carbon dioxide, but also on methane and nitrous oxide.
Okay.
Anybody else need to comment on that, Dave?
Just briefly, we have had in the past REU projects that looked at methane emissions or methane flux from different aquatic habitats, because mostly the natural source of methane is mostly oxygen poor organic material underwater, so the muck of swamps or so on. And we've got a big invasive species, a cattail, that is just growing over everything along the shorelines of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and it outcompetes or really just sort of overtops or covers over the native vegetation by just producing tremendous amounts of leaf litter, which then after more and more is piled upon it, the lower levels become, oxygen doesn't get to them, so they become anoxic and they start emitting methane. So there's been a fair amount of work trying to figure out where in something like the Sheboygan Marsh, where are the real hotspots for methane emission, and what can be done to reduce, basically to aerate, reduce methane emissions. But it hasn't been a major focus of a long-term research project. I think that the methane, it's the second most important greenhouse gas at this point. Carbon dioxide is about 60% of our warming. Methane probably between 15 and 20% of our effect. Most of it, not most of it, a lot of it is natural. We aren't going to do anything about that unless we want to dry up all the wetlands. There is a fair amount emitted when fossil fuels are burned, and what you mentioned, Nikki, the melting of the permafrost, where that melting creates surface water, basically ponds, little lakes or big lakes, then the permafrost below it can be warm enough to decompose, but it can't get oxygen because there's too much water covering it. And if the bacteria that are doing the decomposition can't access oxygen, then they or other ones, instead of making carbon with 2 oxygens on it, CO2, they make carbon with 4 hydrogens on it, methane. So that is a feedback that is recently recognized. We don't know how strong it'll be. And I think it all depends on how much surface meltwater remains.
I didn't think it was surface necessarily with the peat and the permafrost, because it's bubbling up from the bottom. So it's sort of like the ponds, that it's coming from the bottom. There's less oxygen at the bottom of the pond. And I think that's happening with the peat too, and the permafrost. But that, from what I've been reading,
I'm not sure about that, because the permafrost, although it's warming to at least 40 meters, is not thawing except in the top maybe 2 feet. So it's still frozen below that. And
permafrost in the 60s defrosted up to a foot every year, or at least, because my cousin was an archaeologist, and every summer in Alaska, they could go and dig just a little bit deeper. It's defrosting more than that now.
And that summer warming is now penetrating a little bit deeper.
Right.
The warming is penetrating far, but it's not warm enough to be unfrozen, except for the very top layer.
Okay, Laura has been waiting patiently to ask what will be the last question, and then that'll give us a couple minutes for announcements. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, have a comment first and then a question, probably for Dave. I just wondered if you're already in any way collaborating with the Outdoor Discovery Center here in West Michigan in the Holland area. The directors, Travis Williams, he really works intently with farmers in the area, and he's just a great networker and advocate. And they've got a nature-based preschools. Last summer they ran a summer school for second graders for nature-based summer school program. So just a lot of opportunity in this Holland, West Michigan area there. He could be a great resource for you. And then Dave, yesterday I was able to catch the last part of your talk to the Hope College group, and I was just devastated when you were talking about the white pine trees, and just kind of wondered, we've got 5 acres here where we live, and we've been planting white pines like crazy, over the years, and just what does that mean? Will our white pines die, or should we never plant any more white pines going forward?
I think if you plant them now, this is not an expert opinion. This is sort of an educated guess. But if you plant them now, conditions are fine for seedlings and saplings right now. Once they get big, they're quite resistant to things like drought because their roots go deep enough that they can still access groundwater. So I would say probably, my guess is you probably have 30 years, 20 to 30 years when a white pine that you planted will live a long time, probably a normal lifespan. except if fires get more common. That's pretty much the only thing that would kill them, I think. Or if there is an insect pest that comes up from the south, that's a pine specialist, like the pine beetle out west or something. But I think from just the climate itself, you still have time to safely plant, and you don't need to worry about the ones you already have.
Any other responses to Laura? Okay, then how about announcements? We have a couple minutes left. Does anybody have an announcement of things you know of coming up that you want to share? Laura, your hand is still up. I don't know if you have an announcement too. Anyone?
Hello.
Hi, Crystal.
Hi, I just wanted to say that if anybody's interested in Halloween related things, the Office for Sustainability at the Gibbs House has a Halloween event, and it's pretty fun. So yeah, it's tonight. I think it starts at 5 or 6, and there'll be food, a movie, haunted related things. So yeah, it should be pretty fun.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. Tim?
Let's see. I hope I'm still unmuted. Okay, so I just put in the chat the names of 2 organizations that I would hope all of you would associate yourselves with. There are many organizations working on the climate crisis. Citizens Climate Lobby and the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition are just, one has a national focus, the other a local focus. I invite you all to join us.
All right. And I'll invite you to join us for the second Saturday of November. It's the only November program we're going to have on Fridays for Future. And that the title of it is Climate Friendly Holiday Meals, where Christina Petrovska of the Kalamazoo Valley Community College Food Innovation Center will do a virtual presentation with a cooking demonstration. Nikki?
And don't forget, COP27 starts on the 8th of November. There'll be plenty of places on the internet to follow what's being discussed and to get summaries or whatever of what's going on. Because I think it's going to be an important COP. I think everybody's entering it with a feeling of pessimism and a lot of greenwashing. Man, when I was listening to this conference for the last 2 days, it was a lot of greenwashing. AT&T, Verizon, all of the big companies are saying how great they are. So we're going to have to really pay attention to that. But COP27 starts on November 8th.
All right. Thank you. Unless there's some other comment from anybody, I want to thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you and others you know who you'll bring to the next Fridays for Future. Tim, you want to say one last thing?
I do, which is I'm in charge of sending the emails for the Kalamazoo Climate Crisis Coalition. 2 announcements about this event went to about 1,200 people. You can see how few people are actually in attendance here, most of whom were preaching to the choir. So I don't know what I can do to get those other 1,200 people more involved, but if you have ideas and suggestions, please.
Thanks, Tim. And I'll thank every one of you who did come today. And some of you are regular attendees and some are new. We hope you'll come back again. Thank you very much. See you the second Friday of November.